Okay, welcome to another random walk down Mill Street. Tonight's topic, Lost and Found, the search for America's oldest Tefillin. Um, I think I'm just going to get right into it as opposed to giving you too much introduction. But I do want to just tell you that this is something that I have been thinking about for a long time, and eventually I want to publish it. So you are my guinea pigs. And when the class is over, let me know what you think, what you liked and what you didn't like, and what you think should be told more in depth, and what should be widely distributed or known, and what parts I can skip over. That would be helpful. Okay, without further ado. Um, oh, thank you. Thank you, Alexander. Okay. Let me uh let me get to my shared screen here. Here it is. Okay. Okay. You can see my screen? Great. Lost and Found: The Search for America's Oldest Tefillin. So the starting off point, and why is this not moving out of the way? Okay. The starting off point for this talk is something that I saw in the archives, which has been in the archives since 1997. As you see on the left, there's a piece of paper here, which was a flyer that was sent out by the synagogue in 1997 for the celebration of the 100th anniversary of our current synagogue building, the building here on 70th, which was consecrated on Lag LaOmer in 1897. And so on the anniversary of that, the 100th anniversary, they had something like had already had some celebrations earlier, where they honored Judith Kay and some other things. But on the actual date of the anniversary or the weekend of the anniversary, they made some special events. They did some special things on Shabbat, as you can see. And then on Sunday, there was an open house. Open house had a whole bunch of uh, aspects to it, tours and exhibits and musical program. But I want you to just take a look at the bottom here. Opening of time capsule from 1860. Um, and what that was in the archives was a lead or iron box, a very heavy sealed box, which the archivist at the time figured out was the cornerstone of our 1860 synagogue. And in the minutes of the congregation, as had been already published by David de Soto Pool, there's a description of what was put into that cornerstone at the laying of the cornerstone for the 1860 synagogue, which took place on July 11th, 1859. And you can see here that what was put inside the cornerstone when they had that ceremony was a metallic plate with Hebrew inscription with the date, names of trustees and officers of the congregation. I have seen that plate. Um, a parchment containing the names of the executive officers of the United States and the state of New York. I don't think I've seen that one. The history of the congregation for nearly 210 years. I don't think I've seen that one, although it must be somewhere in our archives. A copy of the Constitution and bylaws of the congregation, copies of various benevolent societies' constitutions. I think I've seen the folder containing those. Um, a Hebrew Bible, daily prayer book, marriage contract, a set of tefillin, tzitzit, mezuzah, compendium of the burial service, copies of the consecration service of the Mill Street Synagogue, various documents, 6 vials with relics from Jerusalem, newspapers of the day, and sundry coins. That is the inventory. And that is what was taken out. I think Mark Aaron, who is on this class tonight, may have videoed that event. I'm not sure. I'd like to see a video if anyone has it of that actual event. But that's what was done on that Sunday in May in 1997 for the 100th anniversary of the synagogue building. So in the archives, I found some of those items. I've even spoken about some of those items here, including the vials with relics from Jerusalem. Although at the time that I spoke about them, I did not realize where they had come from. So we'll have to redo that class one day with an update. But you can see here on the bottom the tzitzit and the tefillin. When I found them, I was disappointed that the tzitzit were not tied, and they're just the wool that would make tzitzit. So teaching us nothing about how they tied tzitzit in 1859. But I was delighted to see the tefillin, which you can see pictured here. What you don't get a sense of, because I didn't give you anything for uh, comparison, is the scale. They are tiny, tiny, tiny tefillin. The one on the right here is the shelyad. It is about half an inch. This box here is about half an inch square, and the whole bottom base is less than an inch or about an inch wide. Um, the shel rosh, the head tefillin, is a little larger, but still by today's standards, tiny, tiny, tiny tefillin. And so I got thinking about these tefillin, and I was thinking that having these objects is significant and interesting. What can we learn from them? Uh, by the way, well, maybe I'll save that for later, but I also wanted to tell you that I think these are much older than 1859. I have no way to prove it, but I think they're much older. And one of the reasons I think they're much older is the ritzuot, uh, because when you feel them, they're smooth and very leathery, which you might not think much of. But if you have worn tefillin, you know that when you first get a pair of tefillin and you first get those brand new ritzuot, they are stiff and, for lack of a better term, rough. And only after you wear them and they get, you know, oils on them and wear and tear on them, do they become smooth and from wear. And so these are smooth. So I think they were an older pair of tefillin when they were placed into the time capsule in 1859. But that's what I want to talk about tonight. And as you'll see, not we're going to go from this as our starting off point, but we're going to end up with a different pair of tefillin completely. But so this is what I discovered about 2, 3 years ago in the archives. Um, and here are some more pictures of them and get a little better sense of them. Uh, this is to give you a sense of scale. These are what you see here on the right of this. These are normal sized, even slightly small-ish tefillin that we have in the synagogue that we offer people if they come to synagogue without their own. We offer them these. They are not extra large. They're not the Hasidic style, if you're familiar. These are, dakot, pshutot, the simple kind, older kind, relatively small, not tiny, but normal sized tefillin that you might see in anybody wearing in synagogue. And next to them, by comparison, are the tefillin from 1859. They're tiny, tiny, tiny tefillin. You cannot buy tefillin this size today, no matter, you go to the most amazing and most expensive sofer and you say, I want the smallest tefillin you can possibly find. They're not going to be this small. One other interesting thing about them is that they're not perfectly square. They are square around here, but they are tall, which when I first saw, I thought was fascinating. And then as I learned more, is perfectly fine halachically, that they have to be square on the top like here, but they don't have to be cubed. They can be a little shorter or a little taller. But today, you won't find tefillin this shape. Uh, the other thing is the shalrosh has special shins. Maybe one day we'll talk about the shins on the shalrosh. Um, and I was quite interested by the way this shin is written. You won't find modern sofarim writing a shin this way, just the way that the tops of the shin are angled. And it has a flat bottom, which indicates that it's Sephardic. More on that another day. But these are the tefillin that I found. These tiny, tiny tefillin compared to what a modern day tefillin looked like. So just very briefly, one slide on some images of historical tefillin. The top left, tefillin are ancient. They're not mentioned specifically in detail in the Torah. They're sort of learned out from verses in the Torah, some of which come from the Shema, from other places. Um, but that we should have a sign on our hand and a frontlet between the eyes. And they have been found in ancient archaeological sites such as Masada or Qumran or other places in the Judean desert. Uh, and those that have been found from that era are really tiny, smaller than the ones that I found in the archives. And these are pictures of them. They're really, really small. I don't have, I should have put some kind of measurement, but they're really tiny. You can see some of them in the Israel Museum where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. The writing is nearly micrographic. It's incredible, actually. And these are the head tefillin, where they have four separate compartments. Here is a yad, a hand tefillin, which is one compartment. Very, very, very tiny. When you get a little further on into the Middle Ages, this is a pair of tefillin that was found in the Geniza, Cairo Geniza. And the interesting thing about it is it appears to be round. Whether it's actually round or not, I'm not 100% sure. Um, that's a whole nother class for a whole nother time about the shape of the tefillin. They're supposed to be cubed. They're supposed to be square. Um, Round tefillin. There's a Talmudic uh, statement against having round tefillin on your forehead. Question about the yad. Another class for another time. But you can see also here this is from an 18th century engraving by Peak Art, showing, by the way, the Spanish Portuguese community. And he also has this round tefillin here, kind of unusual thing. So the Shel Rosh and the Shel Yad. So just to give you a sense of what images there are not a lot of actual tefillin like this one. There's very few uh, tefillin found from, let's say, early modern or medieval period. And that is probably to be expected because these are things that when they wear down and become not kosher for use, people generally bury them. Um, so there are not that many uh, old tefillin around. In fact, if you go looking on the antiquities market to try to buy old tefillin, the oldest ones you're going to find are around 1900. Maybe you'll find some 19th century ones, but really early 20th century is about as old as you'll find for sale. Um, if you find an earlier one, tell me I want to bid on it. Okay. That's the story. So when I was looking at our tefillin from the archives, I thought maybe this is something significant. Old tefillin from America. There are examples of older tefillin from Europe, but how many old tefillin from America are there? What can we learn from them? That was the thought process that I had. So I started researching about tefillin in America. Maybe there are some examples, maybe there's references that I could discover. And there are literary references, primary references from people writing about tefillin, mentioning it in their letters. Here are a few examples. Just for there's not a great number, but they exist. So one of the ones that I like the best is a letter from Benjamin Sheftal to a friend of his or a business partner of his in London, where he complains that he uh, did not receive the tefillin that this correspondent in London sent to him. To my misfortune, I never received the tefillin that you sent. I do not know which way they were sent, nor do I know the name of the captain or the name of the ship, and I can't even inquire about them. I don't know where to go to. You said, I heard you said you sent them, or you said you were going to send them, but I have not received anything, and I have no idea how to find out where they are. I hope you will soon find out whether that ship was taken by an enemy or lost at sea. Maybe the way you sent it, maybe they never got here. If she is not taken or lost, I hope you will let me know where to find them. Where did you send these tefillin? Um, I leave your honor to guess what grief I am in to be so misfortuned, my eldest son being 3 months ago 13 years of age, and I not have any frontlets nor books fit for him. I don't have tefillin for my bar mitzvah boy son. Um, and that's what he says in March 1748. So clearly he's buying tefillin, and clearly it's not so easy to get. And in this case, they didn't come on time, and he doesn't have anything for his son who's bar mitzvah, and he is upset about that. Another place where someone's writing about tefillin is actually in a dispute, and it just comes as an aside. This here on the bottom is a letter from, I think, the 1780s, from Joseph Simon, who was the founder of the Jewish community of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And this is just a description of some of the letters. They're writing in Yiddish, is him and someone who he had a dispute with, who was boarding with him, and then didn't pay rent. And so he took his possessions and he held them. And then he sent back to this guy who he was having a dispute with his talit, his tefillin, his prayer book, his shechita knife, so that he could be a good Jew. But he's keeping the rest. And then later, in a different letter from the guy who was boarding with him, who had this dispute with him, he wrote that for 15 days he didn't have his tefillin. So the point that I'm trying to make here is merely that tefillin are mentioned sort of as a byproduct of everyday correspondence in colonial days. And there's another quote from, or a description of a story of tefillin from someone from our community, Naphtali Phillips. Probably dates, it's undated, but it probably dates from the early 19th century. An amusing story is told of Naphtali Phillips. This is Naphtali Phillips, that on one occasion he was traveling to Philadelphia by boat. Water travel being the universal in those days before railroads. And as it was very stuffy in the cabin, he went and lay his tefillin on the deck. He went up to the deck and put on his tefillin. One of my uncles, his son, remonstrated with him and suggested he go, what are you doing here? Go into your room to put those tefillin on. Whereupon he turned to Naphtali Phillips and said, young man, if you are ashamed of your religion, I am not. Which is a really great story about him putting on tefillin in public on a ship sometime in the early 19th century. But examples of actual tefillin are not existent. There are no tefillin that I have ever found that are from colonial America or even early federal America. But there is one more story. And this is a story of the phylacteries found in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I just want to know who my audience is. So I'm curious to know how many of you, or if any of you, know about the phylacteries found in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. You can raise your hand. You can write in the group if anybody has heard of this before. I see a few nods, which is excellent because it's such a fascinating story. Okay, we'll get back to it right now. So in 1917, there was an article written in the Publications of the American Jewish Historical Society by Lee Friedman. Lee Max Friedman was an American Jewish historian. He was a lay historian. I think he was a lawyer by profession, but he was one of these early historians that was very involved with the American Jewish Historical Society in its early years. And he published a lot. So in one article that he published in 1917, he talks about the phylacteries found in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And I'll give you the story. We're going to go right into it. While plowing in summer of 1815 on Indian Hill, this is in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, not a very big place, but you can go there today. Captain Merrick turned up with his plow what proved to be a phylactery. Elkanah Watson, one of Pittsfield's distinguished pioneers, gives the following contemporary account of the discovery. Here you see a picture of Dr. Elkanah Watson. All of these figures are interesting. And I don't want to distract you too much, but Elkanah Watson was the first person to ever have thought of having a county fair. And he did it right there in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The very first county fair was held in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, organized by this fellow Watson, because he wanted all the farmers to get together and show off their different produce and show who had the best whatever, squash or corn or whatever it was. He was supporting agriculture in New England at the time. Okay. This is a letter he writes November 10th, 1815, to someone named Hugh Williamson, who I don't know much about. Dear Sir, in conformity with your request to ascertain all the facts in relation to the interesting discovery of a Jewish phylactery in this village in June last, I reply. It was plowed up in the yard of Mr. Joseph Merrick, a respectable inhabitant who resides on the borders of the village, in the midst of rubbish, and lying some inches below the surface. Immediately on hearing the rumor of the discovery, I repaired to the house of Mr. Merrick, where I found several clergymen whose curiosity was excited by the strange incident, and who believed with me that the article must have found its way into this recent wilderness by the agency of some descendants of Israel. They thought must come from a Jewish person, a descendant of old Israel, who brought it to here. Having previously read with intense interest on the subject and being impressed with the belief that the Indians of America were descended from the lost tribes of Israel, and that they had been directed by the same almighty hand which had brought them out of Egypt to continue their journeys into the northeast, probably for many ages, and finally to reach this continent, yet retaining some knowledge of the arts and sciences and always adhering to the rites of the Jewish religion. So he's saying, I know, or I've heard, that the Native Americans are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. After reaching this continent and the lapse, it is not my purpose to write a treatise on this important subject, he says. But I think it is well known, or here, this discovery forms another link in the evidence by which our Indians are identified with the ancient Jews. He says, I heard this thing that the Native Americans are descendants of the 10 lost tribes, and here's another proof for it. The discovery of this phylactery in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. On comparing this phylactery with those described in the Old Testament, I found an exact conformity. I will explain it in my own way. They are described in Scripture as composed of 5 folds of raw hide or leather. There's no such scripture describing tefillin. Sewed compactly together by the entrails of animals. In order to understand the appearance of this discovery, imagine 5 pieces of leather or rawhide or some composition similar to India rubber and capable of resisting the ravages of time and exposure, cut into cut into squares of 2 inches, sewn together with entrail. Suppose also a hole in the center, 1/2 inch in diameter, to admit a tube 2.5 inches long, with eyelet holes at the corners to receive the strings, and you will have an idea of the article. This tube, as described by Mr. Terrick, was of such hard, spongy substance that it was with great difficulty that he could gain an opening at one of the sloping ends, and seemed absolutely impervious to moisture, for although the surface was encrusted in a manner to evince of having been exposed for many ages, I drew out from the tube 3 or 4 scrolls of parchment, which it contained, when found, and inscribed with texts of Scripture, written in Hebrew in an elegant manner, and the ink of a beautiful jet black. The parchment, writing, ink were all perfectly fresh. That is the letter he writes in 1819, few months after its discovery, by this Elkanah Watson, the most important resident of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, about the phylactery that was found in the field of Joseph Merrick. It becomes a news story, and it gets carried around, but not everywhere. It's not that widely known initially. And then a pretty famous of its time work was published by someone named Reverend Ethan Smith called The View of the Hebrews. And Ethan Smith, this is him, was a pastor of the Congregationalist Church in Vermont. And in 1823, he published this book supporting the contention that the Indians were the 10 lost tribes. When this book came out, the president of Williams College writes to him and says, you know about the Tefillin that were found in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, right? You know about those. And he didn't. So Reverend Smith immediately undertook an investigation to use this find of the Tefillin in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, as further evidence to support his contention. So he made a journey to Pittsfield and he interviewed different aged people and convinced himself that no Jew was ever known in Pittsfield. There were no Jews in Pittsfield. So where did this Tefillin come from? Must have come from the lost tribes, Native Americans who were wearing Tefillin in ancient American days, and they dug it up as an, artifact. That's what. So then he publishes the second edition of his book, includes this long story about the Pittsfield phylactery in his book, where he describes the whole thing. So it's not in the first version of 1823, but it's in the second edition of 1825, the whole story that we just read earlier. In the article that I mentioned, which was written by Lee Friedman, he then takes this story and he tries to identify were there any Jews who lived in Pittsfield, Massachusetts? And he cannot identify any Jews who lived in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. But he concludes, whether lost by an early settler or dropped by some pioneer traveler, the finding of the phylacteries at Pittsfield affords only another indication of the ubiquity of the Jew in early colonial America. He's not buying any of this junk about Native American artifacts. These are Tefillin, and they are must have been dropped by somebody. Okay, that's the story. That's the story. Now, there's another piece of the story which I don't think I mentioned here yet, but Lee Friedman mentions that the tefillin, after they were discovered, were sent around to various, essentially ministers, to experts in religion, to examine them, examine these scrolls, and then they were placed in the collection of the American Antiquarian Society, which is also up in Massachusetts. But when Lee Friedman went there to find them, couldn't find them. It says they're supposed to be there, he couldn't find them. Lee Friedman updates the article that he wrote in the 1930s, saying that he went to all sorts of places where they might have been. Anyone who might have had a hand holding them can't find any reference to them. They ought to be in the American Antiquarian Society, but they're not there. They're lost. Now, just to show you how far this spreads, this is Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is the founder of Mormonism, Church of Latter-day Saints. And to show why this story is important, this quote here on the right is just from the first paragraph of his Wikipedia article. Born in Vermont, Joseph Smith moved with his family to Western New York following a series of crop failures in 1816. He lived in an area with intense religious revivalism during the Second Great Awakening, and Smith reported experiencing a series of visions. The first was in 1820, when he saw two persons whom he eventually described as God and Jesus. In 1823, he said that he was visited by an angel who directed him to a buried book of golden plates inscribed with a Judeo-Christian history of ancient American civilization. And then in 1830, he published the Book of Mormon, which he described as an English translation of those golden plates. Then he founded this church, which we now know as Mormons, and you can find them walking around with their white shirts and name tags here and there. In 1842, so after his religion is taken off and he's moved from New York to Illinois, to the city of Nauvoo, he publishes every month something called Times and Seasons. This is written by him, by Joseph Smith. And in the edition that comes out in June 1842, it's many pages, but he quotes this story about the 10 tribes coming to America and the Native Americans being the lost tribes of Israel, and that Joseph Merrick, a highly respectable character in Pittsfield, found in 1815 when he was digging in his field a pair of phylacteries. He goes through the whole story. I don't quote it here for you, but just to show you the opening, and he's quoting it to show that the ancient Israelite religion was found buried as an artifact from Native Americans in America. It directly supports his claims that there were golden tablets, ancient golden tablets that he found in New York State. Um, so this is an important find for Mormons. It helps support the basis of the Mormon religion. Not directly, of course, but it tends to show that such a find is possible. And there was another find of ancient phylacteries in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Okay. But like I said, the actual object couldn't be found. So now, in 1985, there was a donation made to the American Antiquarian Society of a letter, an original letter that described the discovery and the examination of this phylactery in the field of Joseph Merrick. And it was donated by a collector or a dealer to the American Antiquarian Society in 1985, and then it was published by this fellow, William Getzman. He titled his article, The Case of the Missing Phylactery. And this is from one of his introductory paragraphs. The case of the phylactery's disappearance is inextricably bound to the early history of the American Antiquarian Society. The Society briefly held the famous document and regularly received inquiries regarding its whereabouts for more than 150 years. Thus, the American Antiquarian Society was the logical place for a recent donation by the book dealer William Reese of New Haven, Connecticut. Mr. Reese's gift to the Society was a letter dated March 30th, 1821, from the Reverend William Allen, president of Bowdoin College, to Dr. John James of Albany, New York. The letter discusses the excavation of the phylactery in some detail, as well as the ensuing speculation regarding its origins, and also contains Allen's own opinion and conclusion regarding the significance of the find. Okay, so in 1985, whoops. Okay, I guess that's, oh, okay. 1985, this letter gets given to the American Antiquarian Society. Still don't have the phylactery itself, which is why he calls it the case of the missing phylactery. And now we'll read the letter because I think it's actually quite interesting, especially compared to what we saw before. Okay. Why is it not full screen? Okay. William Allen to John James, 1821. Dear Sir, in reply to your favor of the 9th, making inquiries respecting a Jewish phylactery found in Pittsfield about 7 or 8 years ago, I will give you all the information which at my leisure will time allow me to give you. You are incorrect in supposing it was found digging a well at a depth of 30 feet. It wasn't deep down in the ground. It was found, as I was told at the time, in the removal of rubbish before the house and clearing a yard between the house and the woodhouse, in which chips and dirt had been accumulated for years, and was found at a depth of about 2 to 4 feet from the surface. Whether it was among the chips or below them in the earth, I could not learn. So the first thing he says is, it wasn't, you heard that it was way deep down the ground. It wasn't so deep down the ground. It was a few feet under the ground. A boy living with Mr. Merrick found the phylactery. On the last page of his letter, I will give some description of this curiosity which may refresh your memory. Reverend William Sylvester Larned, then living in Pittsfield, brought the article to me to decipher the obscure Hebrew letters. On 4 pieces of parchment, and formed in beautiful small Hebrew letters, the 4 passages of Scripture which have commonly constituted phylacteries. He says, we know what phylacteries are. They had them. These were the written out biblical quotes. At first, I had the impression that it was an ancient relic, as you express it, and that it furnished proof that our Indians were descendants of the ancient chosen people. So at first, I thought, just like you are saying, John James, that this is an ancient artifact from Native American lost tribes of Israel. A part of the phylactery seemed to be made of untanned deer skin and to be sewed with the sinews of entrails of animals. And who so likely to use leather as Indians? But against this impression of the origin of the phylactery rose up the considerations that no other phylactery has been found among the Indians. You don't find Native Americans putting on tefillin every morning. And that if it had been found in the ground for ages, it would have become not merely defaced as to the manuscript, and hard and horny as to the leather, but decomposed and destroyed. If this was something ancient, it wouldn't have been in such good condition as we found it. So it must be a straggling Jew, one of whom was remembered in Pittsfield a few years before, might have dropped it. And what is the most probable supposition? That a concealed Jew among the German and British prisoners then in Pittsfield had lost it while employed as a laborer by Mr. Merrick, for he had employed prisoners. However, on inquiry, you may possibly find that the circumstances will discredit this last supposition, if the article was actually dug up 2 or 3 feet from the surface. If a prisoner dropped it, it must have been at the time of digging. Okay, then he says, I'm glad that you're taking an interest in the subject, blah, 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 blah. And then, this is actually important. Soon after receiving the article from Mr. Learned, I sent it to Dr. Holmes in Cambridge for the American Antiquarian Society. In their museum at Worcester, I presume it may be seen. So he's writing where you can find it, and this is what he knows about it. This is a really interesting letter. It's contemporaneous by someone who saw it when it was found, and who was brought to like, hey, there's Hebrew here. You can read Hebrew. What does it say? And he says, I first thought, like everybody else thought, oh, this must be an American Indian, Native American artifact from very ancient times. But then he thought about it. Said, no, it doesn't make any sense. Native Americans don't put on tefillin. It was in good shape. It couldn't be that ancient. It must be that some passing by Jewish person dropped it. And then, interestingly, he says that this guy Merrick, on whose field it was found, had actually used labor from prisoners of war from the War of 1812, because Pittsfield, Massachusetts was a place where prisoners of war were interred. There was an American jail camp, I don't know what you want to call it, um, for those people who were those British soldiers who were captured or who defected were sent there, and the local farmers got to hire them out as cheap day laborers. So he thinks maybe one of them was a Jew and who dropped his tefillin either consciously or unconsciously while they were doing work in the field of Merrick. Okay, that's what he says. So he writes in this article that the original has, you can see it here. He says, where did he write it? On the last page, I'll give you some description of this curiosity, which may refresh your memory. So I wanted to see what they looked like. So I wrote to the American Antiquarian Society. I knew they didn't have the actual item that's described as being lost already since 1917, or even earlier, perhaps. But this letter by William Allen with its picture was sent in 1985. They should have that. So the next day I got a reply by the curator or librarian there with a picture of the letter. And here it is. And it has really great pictures of tefillin right here. Exactly as tefillin as you would imagine to find it. And then it has, and he writes here, it's a little hard to see here, that these are exact, that he like traced them. These are the size of them on the paper. I don't need to show you much about the size, but that's why he draws it this way. This is one shorter one longer one, and he even puts a little bit of the writing in it. But I have no idea if the writing is his own writing or if he's actually trying to imitate the ktav of the tefillin that he read. I don't know. But he puts a little bit in there. And he tells you where they came from. Deuteronomy, Exodus. This is what you would expect to find in tefillin. So that's as close as you're going to get to the tefillin, I thought. And then the next day, after sending me this letter, she wrote me back and says, "Oh, did you see this article by a fellow named Christian? I forget his name, Christian Mather or Malter?" I said, "No." So she sends me a link to an article, Christian Mucher, Collecting for Salvation, American Antiquarianism and the Natural History of the East. It's in a journal, an online journal called Commonplace, and it was published in October 2022, not that long ago. It's an article about the American Antiquarian Society and its mission and how that's all tied up with Christian ideas of salvation. And so all these ideas of Native Americans and ancient Judeo-Christian religion coming together in early America is all part of the American Antiquarian Society's founding. That's the point of the article. But in the article, the very first image shown is this. This is the Pittsfield phylactery, which everyone thought was missing. Was not missing, just wasn't in the American Antiquarian Society. It was in the Peabody Museum in Harvard. And I wrote to the author of this article, and he wrote me back. And I said, "How did you find this? You know, everyone says it's missing. How did you come across it?" He said, "I was a fellow at the American Antiquarian Society in 2015. I had access to handwritten records of all of the transfers of deaccessioning things from the American Antiquarian Society to other institutions. This information was not easily available at the time. Subsequently, you can find it online in their catalogs, but it wasn't at the time. And so it included information on transfers to Harvard, the Worcester Art Museum, the National Museum, the Smithsonian, maybe other places too. And so he's following up on this thing that he found with these list of objects that were transferred out. And he went to the Peabody in fall of 2015, and he asked them to bring up any objects from this list that he gave them from the American Antiquarian Society. And they came back to him with this. It was the only object that they allowed him to see physically, or one of the few that they allowed him to see physically. And here it was. And he says, I asked him, why didn't anybody find it? He says, probably because they were looking for phylactery. And it was filed under frontlet. Frontlet being something worn on the head, tefillin, tefillin shel rosh, being worn on the head, frontlet. And so they couldn't find it. You went to the librarian or they went to the archivist and said, "Do you have the phylactery found in Pittsfield, Massachusetts?" There's no phylactery here in the catalog, but they should have been looking for frontlet. That's what he theorizes. But here it is. So my next step was to go up there and take a look at it in person. This is tefillin, found in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where no Jews lived in around 1815 or 1818. These are, based on my earlier research, the oldest tefillin in America that are still extant. So I went to take a look at them. And here's the Peabody Museum at Harvard. It's a nice old building. When you go into the Peabody Museum, they have a little gift shop right in the beginning before you actually get into the museum. Quite interestingly, they sell artifacts, they sell objects like this hat, which says, "You are standing on native ground," which I thought was kind of interesting. A lot of the museum is Native American objects, which they are in the process of sending back or determining what to do with to the original tribes that own them. And then they brought me to a room where they had the object for me. And it was more than I expected because in the picture from the article, it just had this. But they also brought me this, which is the base of the tefillin. And when you open them up, you have the bottom, top, and the scrolls. Now, if you're familiar with tefillin, um, you know that is not tefillin shel rosh. That is shel yad. How do you know that? Because it's one container. It's not four compartments that you would find in the Shel Rosh. It's one container. So it's Tefillin Shalad. It's one phylactery, what we would call a tefillah. It's the hand, it's not the Shel Rosh. So already I found something that no one really discussed earlier, just based on looking at the actual object. And they unfortunately did not let me open it up. The curator thought that it was too fragile for me to unroll. And I was very disappointed because one of my reasons for going up to see it in person was I really wanted to look at the katav, the the type of writing. Was it Sephardic? Was it Ashkenazic? What could we find about it? But a few things I was able to see just by seeing it. First of all, it's quite long. I mean, it's smaller than modern day tefillin by quite a bit, but it's not a perfect cube like you would find today. Much more like the tefillin that I found in our archives, where it's uh, square but tall. And clearly, the square that had been originally got crushed, so that it wasn't a perfect square anymore, and it was sort of out of shape. And that got me thinking actually about some of those pictures from the Cairo Geniza. And I wonder if some of those originally square things ended up being round. And that's what happens over time when you have the Shel Yad. Anyway, it's a side point. Um, After going up there and not being allowed to see the tefillin, I then engaged in quite a lengthy effort to have them unroll it for me, or if they were not willing to unroll it, to try to have it scanned in some way that could show us the writing inside without having to unravel it. This is a dream I had because I read that in Pompeii they found these scrolls and they didn't have to unroll them. They could scan them with some, I don't know how they do it, MRI type stuff, and figure out what's written inside. So I asked them that, I said, if any place is going to be able to do it, it's going to be Harvard. You know, they have all the labs needed to do this kind of work. So I wrote to them. They said, "Oh, we're a little bit backed up right now. We'll get back to you soon." But I didn't take no for an answer. And every month I wrote to them. Every month I wrote them. Well, any update? Any update? Do you have any update? I think I irritated them so much that eventually they just went and started taking some pictures. And they would not unroll the whole thing, but they did unroll a little bit of it. And this is what they sent me after months of asking. This is like an infrared, so you could see the letters a little better. Just this little bit. And I don't know if you can see what I see here on your screen, but this is from the Shema that we are familiar with. One of the four parshiot that are in the Tefillin, and this is one that we're very familiar with. This says Echad. This is the end of God's name. Yud He Vav He Echad. The Ahavta is written here. You can see the Aleph, the Vav here. Some of the other letters that you can see, Biship Techa Beveitecha, here's Upkumecha. This is the end of the word Totafot. So you have the Shema. And what I did was there is I plotted it out so that I could figure out what was on the whole line there. Um, and it matches closely, but not exactly to the way modern scribes uh, do tefillin. They're all tefillin are almost exactly the same now in terms of what the lines that they start on, the lines that they end on, the words in the beginning, and the words at the end of each thing. And it very closely matches what's done by modern standards, but not exactly. So some of the words at the end of the verse, other modern scribes would be at the beginning of the next line, and some of the words at the end would be not the end. Um, but it has the same number of lines, which I thought was interesting. Okay, it's a little safrut, expertise, which we don't need to get into. But this little scrap, I was hoping could figure out if this was Ashkenazic or Sephardic. It's a little hard to tell because you can't see the letters so well. You can see that it has a chet that's flat. Flat chet is an older type of chet. Nowadays, when the scribes write the chet, they have a roof that's done in the center. Um, So you already know this has some age to it. And I tried to really make out the Aleph because usually the Aleph is the easiest way to figure out if it's Ashkenazic or Sephardic based on the way this little bit on the front kicks. If it kicks out that way, it's Sephardic. If it stays in, it's Ashkenazic. But I really couldn't tell from these Alephs too much. The condition is not good enough. But as you look closely, you can see a few things. The shin is not perfectly flat, it's more rounded, which is not a modern style of shin in either Ashkenaz or Sephardic, but it's an older Ashkenazic kind of uh, ktav. And then the kicker, the one that really did it, is this tet. And from the word totafot, this tet is old Ashkenaz. Sephardic tets are more square. This is this is an old Ashkenazic tet. So I knew the tefillin we were looking at was Ashkenazic. Okay, but it tells you that in the early 19th century, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, someone lost Ashkenazic tefillin, or maybe they buried them. Maybe it was not kasher, and so they didn't know what to do with it. They put it in the ground. I don't know how it happened. No one knows how it happened. Pretty sure it wasn't Native Americans. Pretty sure it wasn't ancient lost tribes following rabbinic practices of tefillin. So that's what we can learn. And the amazing thing is that this thing that was considered lost was not lost at all. It was just in a different place under a different name. Um, the Jewish frontlet. It's not a frontlet. It's not a frontlet at all. It's not a shel rosh. It's a shel yad. And that led me to one last kind of observation. Not a discovery exactly, but an observation. Because the halacha is that, how do you write tefillin? Ketzad kotvin et tefillin shel rosh. That's how do you do the head tefillin? You write on the four portions, you write on four klafin. You write them on four pieces of parchment. And you roll each one individually, and you put it in the four compartments of the shel rosh. That's why it has four parts. You put each one into a separate one. And that's how you do it. V'shel yad, how do you do the hand tefillin? Kotvin otan ha'arba parshiyot be'arba dapin al klaf echad. You do the four portions of the tefillin in four columns and four places on one piece of parchment. The golelo kamin sefer Torah, and you roll it up together. Our tefillin from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in the early 19th century, or maybe it's an 18th century tefillin, I don't know, had four separate pieces. How do I know that? Because that's the way Alan, the guy from Bowdoin College, drew them. Four separate pieces, and that's contemporary from the way it was found. Also, even though they didn't let me unroll it, they kind of came up when I was holding it. They came apart. So I knew they were four separate pieces. I put them back together quickly because they didn't want me to undo anything there. But I knew there were four separate pieces. And that was very curious to me. Why would they be four separate pieces in a hand tefillin? But when you read the halacha, actually not that big a deal. Much later, in the next chapter in the Rambam, it says, Tefillah shel yad kotvin ba'arba dapin ba'or echad. You're supposed to write on one thing, one long strip of parchment. But then he says, Im katvan al arba orot, if you did it on four separate pieces of leather, on four separate pieces of parchment, and put them in one box, yatsa. Then you're okay, and you don't have to glue them together. Ein tzarich ledavka. But that's the Sephardic halacha, actually. When you look at the Shulchan Aruch, he quotes this halacha. But when you look at the Ramah, he tells you that you are supposed to v'haminhag ledavkam. You're supposed to glue them together. So our tefillin were not glued together. Now I wasn't able to examine them closely enough. Maybe they once were. Maybe there's some remnant of glue. I have no idea. That's not possible for me to look at in the current state of things. And maybe that's the case. And maybe when they pulled it open to examine it, they came apart. Don't know. But that is some of the observations that I could make on this story of these tefillin. Um, and it's really fascinating. I'm quite sure that these are the oldest tefillin that are around. They were lost for a long time. They you can go see them. You can go to the website of the Peabody Museum, and there's some nice pictures of there. Not of the actual ktav, though, which is what I really want to see. But that's the story of the oldest tefillin, lost and found in America. Now let me address some of your comments and let everybody speak. Okay. Mark Aaron knew a lot of Jews in Pittsfield. You went to camp there for 5 summers. Did you know that there were tefillin buried in the early 19th century, Mark?
No, but I think there was some tefillin at the Camp Winnetou.
Probably so. Which camp was it, Mark?
Camp Winnetou, which was a kosher camp. It was
Camp Winnetou. All
at
right.
the time it was kosher. Not anymore.
But the great thing is that you knew about tefillin and you knew the phylacteries in Pittsfield. Forget about this ancient one. What's written on the box? So written on the box is Jewish frontlet, and then some quote about where it was found and when it was found and when it was given to the American Antiquarian Society. Thank you very much, Mark. And yeah, thank you. That's what I want to do. I want to write an article about these tefillin. Yeah. So it's funny that you mentioned something about anti-Semitism. Now, I don't want to cast any aspersions, but um, I can't figure out why they didn't let me unroll it. I mean, maybe just a fear of not knowing how to handle this material, but I held it in my hand and they didn't let me unroll it. I
No,
held it.
I think not that I want to um, dismiss the possibility of anti-Semitism, but I think archivists and people like that are going to be extremely careful about
Yeah, I
something
think
like that.
they are overly conservative. I think anyone who has handled cloth that, like Sifrei Torah or Tefillin or Mezuzot, know how they feel like they're brittle, but they're leather. They don't easily crack. They don't easily rip.
Yeah, but the lettering does.
The letter, it's not kasher, Claude.
Hmm.
I'm not worried
Yeah.
about that.
No, you don't want to lose it. Lose more of it.
I don't think you would lose it. I don't think. I think you could have opened it up, but they gave me what they could. Maybe they'll let me do a little more someday in the future. But
I'm I'm surprised that the writing was Ashkenazic. I assume Native Americans would be
exactly,
Sephardi.
Native Americans must be Sephardic, of course.
Yeah.
I I thought the lost tefillin you were referring to the guy who lost his son's
Yeah,
tefillin.
that's where they got lost. They got lost in Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Oh, you think that's the guy? That's
They
the
were supposed to go
tefillin?
to Charleston or South Carolina. Yeah, but they
The letter
ended
that
up
he
in
said he felt bad about losing his son's bar mitzvah's tefillin. That's the tefillin?
that must be it.
Yeah? What do you know?
No, there's no follow-up, by the way, with that letter from Charleston. There's no or Savannah. There's no follow-up on did he get his tefillin? I imagine the boy got tefillin eventually. So I don't know. All right, everybody. It's 9 o'clock.
I'm on the website. How do I find it?
You're on the Peabody Museum.
Yes, website.
Um, I can send you a link, but you could look up Tefillin, Tefillin.
Can I ask what was meant by a straggling Jew?
A what?
In one of those letters, the guy conjectured that it was dropped by a straggling Jew.
I think he means like a peddler. I think, in early
Yeah.
America, Jews, even later,
Yes.
people
Yep.
would pass through selling their, you know,
Right.
Jews harps.
Hmm.
Mitch, were you able to find it?
No, I'm trying to send them an email, but that's
No,
not
no,
working.
I'll send you a link. It's on their website. You can find it.
How do you spell tefillin with two L's?
I think it's Tefillin. Okie doke. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Hazaga, bro.
Mitch, write to me and I'll send you a link if you have trouble.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you. Yeah, I tried to find it
Thanks,
too
bro.
under Tefillin and
Write to
frontlets.
me, I'll send you a
Nothing.
link.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not easy to find on there.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.